of Healthy Infosphere on the future of digital platforms and improving transparency of political advertising. This is actually a very important topic right now, as was announced in the European Democracy Action Plan. The European Commission will come up by the end of 2021 with a specific legislation that will deal solely with the issue of political advertising. In a recent webinar, Mrs. Jourova said, and I quote, "We need to challenge some of the business models of big tech. We need to take a closer look at the techniques applied to sponsored political ads," end quote. So it's clear that political advertising is high on the agenda of the European Commission. And it's also clear that this new proposed legislation will sort of serve as a complementary legislation to the already announced Digital Services Act. So it's basically supposed to dig in a bit deeper into this very complex issue and systematize and address some of the problems that political advertising is currently faced with. As we all know, with the move of political advertising to the digital arena, a lot of progress has been made in a way that political actors are able to reach out to their constituencies in a new way, which is great. But there is also a darker side to it. There is a lack of transparency. There are big loopholes which are used for manipulation or perhaps not so ethical activities in the area of political advertising. So all of these, I presume, will be something that the European Commission will want to deal with. And currently, there is a public consultation going on, specifically on the issue of improving transparent political advertising. We as Alliance for Healthy Infosphere are actually looking forward to getting involved in this consultation. And obviously, anybody who's interested to do so is free to do so until 2nd of April. So if you think that you have something important to let the Commission know, absolutely do that. And the reason why we have organized this webinar in the first place was to actually have this kind of initial broader discussion to brainstorm some of the issues that are so pertinent to political advertising. And we wanted to do it in a way that's really embracing the stakeholders that need to be involved in this conversation. So I'm really happy that we have this multi-stakeholder panel. We have Miss Markéta Gregorova, MEP for the Czech Pirates Party and also member of the Special Committee on Foreign Interference in the European Union with us as a representative of basically the European institutions. So welcome, Markéta. We also have Mr. Owen Bennett, Senior Public Policy Manager at the Mozilla Corporation as a representative of the private sector. So we're happy to have rep of private sector with us as well. Welcome, Owen. And finally, we have Nadia Kovalčíková, Program Manager at the Alliance for Securing Democracy in German Marshall Fund's Brussels office. Nadia has been focusing on studying foreign interference as well as on studying Digital Services Act and European Democracy Action Plan. So she will be able to provide us with expert views from the research point of view and perhaps also from the point of view of a user. So just before we dive right in, I'll give you a bit of a structure outline of how this webinar is going to go ahead. So we'll start with some introductory remarks from our distinguished panelists. Then we'll open the discussion to discuss some of the pertinent issues in terms of political advertising, such as I have outlined. Transparency, perhaps we'll touch upon fact-checking and other issues. And of course, in a later stage of this webinar, we'll open the floor to the audience so that they get a chance to ask you questions and to get involved in this conversation as well. So without further ado, let's dive right in. I'll start with Ms. Gregorova because obviously, as this webinar is kind of attempting to serve as a mean to comment on the public consultation initiated by the European Commission, as Ms. Gregorova is a representative of the European Parliament and also member of the INGE committee, which also last week, I believe, discussed draft report on foreign covert political funding, so something very relevant to this topic. I would like to ask you, Ms. Gregorova, what do you think EU needs to do as part of this upcoming legislation? What do you think is crucial in a discussion of political advertising?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. Of course, I am not a shadow rapporteur or rapporteur for the DSA and DMA files, so maybe for more expert view, there will be really the need for Ms. Kowalczykova to step in. However, I still have a few remarks and observations I want to make in regards to our topic. And I do apologize in advance if they sometimes sound too radical. I just don't want this to be a stale debate. Political advertising is by design a controversial topic, opening not only a debate about the freedom of speech, but also about definition of the term political itself. And thus, I think it deserves to be discussed thoroughly. Political advertising is one aspect of an entire industry of indiscriminate mass surveillance and the global real-time trade with information. So transparency alone will not change anything. The business models of the global platform monopolies, they have to change. They have to change either by market forces and competition and the demand of consumers who do not wish to be manipulated or lied to, or by regulation, of course, that forces the monopolies to stop micro-targeting and selling access to billions of people's personal data and lives for the right price. Let me address the second option, mostly the regulation, as I am a legislator. However, I still want to note regarding the first option that I do believe consumers can make such a decision if it is an informed one. When you read Shoshana Zuboff's Age of Surveillance Capitalism, you might get kind of pessimistic about the chances of a user against the monopolies. However, in her writing, there is also hope. The new technologies emerged so quickly that people didn't adapt globally as fast as the corporations. But once they are educated about the system we are living in and why their personal data matter and what purpose they serve in the online food chain, they might start to choose differently. Now, for the aforementioned regulation to deal with the situation at hand, not the utopia, I believe it's necessary in two fields. Firstly, competition law and antitrust law must be applied to the monopolies. Secondly, regulation based on data protection must be enforced with fines and punishments that are bad enough to deter companies with billions of users and hundreds of billions of yearly revenues, so quite a lot. Our GDPR and the upcoming DSA and DMA regulations should provide for that, though it of course might depend on which lobbyists win the legislative tug of war. Personally, I find that the Central European Authority must be able to force the disclosure of who bought what political advertising for what purpose in the entire European Union. Our experience with Facebook and Google not only has shown us that the very last thing these companies will do is so-called self-regulation if it costs them even a cent in profits. They will not disclose the relevant data or hide data by omission. The global lack of data privacy regulation, with the exceptions of the EU's GDPR, which has been effectively stopped by the Irish Data Protection Agency for the last 4 years, and recent laws passed in California, mean that everyone's data is being mass collected and micro-targeted and sold to whoever wants to buy it. Elections are, of course, an interesting market for this, not just for legitimate parties and politicians, but especially for foreign actors in Moscow, Beijing, or Tehran. It is cost-effective for hostile actors to buy up information on how best to divide our society and political landscape. And, well, it needs to stop. The transparency that we need in a binding and enforceable manner must be for political parties, foundations, campaigns, and proxy organizations. Thank you, and with this, I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Marketa, for these very broad and interesting insights, and also for highlighting Mrs. Shoshana Zubov's work, because obviously that's, from the perspective, as you said, from the customer perspective, is very eye-opening experience. And with this, obviously, very critical to big tech, and perhaps this is the right chance to give the word to Mr. Owen Bennett. Often in these conversations on regulating big tech and on data privacy and on disinformation, political advertising, big tech comes off as the bad guy often. So perhaps it would be interesting to know your perspective or Mozilla's perspective. Do you think that political advertising needs to be regulated, or are tech companies capable of handling this themselves? As we have heard, a lot of people in expert community, a lot of people in the legislation circles are quite skeptical of this idea. What do you personally think?
Great, thank you for the question. Maybe a good place to start is just to explain a little bit about what Mozilla is and what we do, because like you are right, we are a private sector company, but I think on a lot of these issues, we come at them from a slightly different perspective than a normal, what you would expect of a tech company, for instance. So we're a corporation, but we're a not-for-profit corporation. So we make products, but ultimately all of the money we make rolls back into the Mozilla Foundation, which ultimately uses those resources to fund philanthropic endeavors, to fund research, and generally to support a movement for a healthier, open, standards-based web. So we engage in public policy around the world, but typically that public policy is not about ensuring that we can maximize our bottom line or keep our shareholders happy. It is largely to ensure that the web within which we operate and within which our products serve as a window, that is a healthy ecosystem, and one which can thrive and which can be based on open, rights protective principles. So that's kind of where we come at these debates from. So it's a slightly different than what one might typically expect from a private sector approach. On the question of regulating political advertising, I think this is an interesting and it's a challenging question, and it's one which kind of gets at the heart of many of the issues that we are trying to solve for in this current EU political mandate. So I think like over the last 15 to 20 years, many people in the space were looking at the internet and looking at what it enabled and focused exclusively on the positives, exclusively on the sense that the internet is an amazing vehicle for innovation. It's an amazing vehicle for enhancing discourse and for generally enabling the flourishing of fundamental rights for individuals and for groups. And in many respects, that promise has come through. And in many respects, the internet has been a great enabler of many things that we like and want to maintain. But obviously, like technology is values-based, and no technology is inherently good. And we have seen in the last couple of years, particularly as the internet has become more and more defined for commercial ends, and as some of the online services have become more and more sophisticated, that we started seeing some of these really kind of problematic downside issues emerge. And democratic discourse is just one example among many of where this has really come to the fore. And obviously we started this, it became a real big topic of public interest, I think, around the time of the 2016 US election, because that was the first time that people in Europe and the US really had to kind of grasp with the consequences of the way in which the online sphere can be weaponized and can influence on its own terms the functioning of democratic discourse, not always for good ends. And so in that sense, some of the legislative proposals you're seeing in Europe at the moment, whether it's the Digital Services Act or the European Democracy Action Plan or the various initiatives that fall under those remits, these are all about trying to really address the role in which the tech sector can play in kind of bringing to the fore these downside issues and trying to ensure that can be managed and that the good things can be maintained. At Mozilla, we've been kind of heavily involved in this initiative for a number of years. So we were an original signatory to the EU Code of Practice on Disinformation, because obviously the efforts to safeguard democracy and to enhance democracy in the digital age, that is a very multifaceted problem, and you can come at this from a host of different angles. Obviously, as a tech company and a tech foundation, we have looked at this through the lens of how can you address the parts of the problem which are enabled by specific technical features or commercial incentives in the online sphere. So for that reason, we focused a lot on online disinformation as one of the key problems that's holding back democracy in the digital age. And we have really tried to focus on how can you better get a sense of the spread of disinformation online, and what kind of policy measures can we put in place to mitigate that. And obviously, we can talk a lot more about that, particularly in the context of online advertising. But essentially, one of our main focuses of work over the last couple of years has to try and ensure that that transparency is in place. And I'll kind of end on the final point to circle back to your question. I don't believe this problem can be solved by self-regulation alone. I think as long as transparency is viewed as a generosity that kind of companies give out voluntarily, then we're never going to really get to a true sense of accountability. And so for that reason, we have been pushing for a number of years for certain forms of transparency to be mandated by law, particularly, and we think that some of those transparency mechanisms can be quite useful for this effort to enhance political transparency and democracy. And so obviously, looking forward to discussing those in more detail, but I will stop there because that's already a lot.
Thank you very much, Owen. I particularly like the idea of transparency as generosity from the tech giant's perspective, because I think it summarizes quite nicely and simply the issue that we're faced here with. So now I turn to Nadia, because we have already outlined the perspective, the legislation from the European institutions. Owen has told us a bit about tech perspective, and now I'm going to turn to you with your perspective as a researcher who has been studying foreign interference for years, who really has a good grasp on what disinformation can do to democracies worldwide. So what do you personally think are the most crucial issues, what we need to deal with in terms of digital political advertising, which should be addressed? I'm not necessarily looking for immediate quick fix solutions, because we know that this is incredibly complex area, and it will be interesting to see what the European Commission will actually come up with by the end of this year. But mostly what this session is supposed to serve as is a place for brainstorming and just highlighting some of the most important aspects that we should be looking at. So over to you, Nadia.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's really interesting to be part of this conversation across three different views of looking at this issue. I think there are quite a few challenges, and as Marketa mentioned in the beginning, it's quite a controversial issue. And I think, for example, micro-targeting is probably one of the most controversial aspects of the political advertising. And it's also addressed in both the European Democracy Action Plan and Digital Services Act, and rightly so. I think it is there is still a lot of work that needs to be done in order to either regulate or provide guidelines and standards to ensure that there is more of a harmonized approach, at least across the EU. For the moment, we have quite a fragmented approach across the members of the European Union. Not only about micro-targeting, but about the political ads and online digital political ads. For the moment, there is some legislation on the broadcasters, but not really on the social media platforms or online media. So I think we still have a lot to do to first ensure that we have more coherent legislation on what online and offline political advertisement means, and what it should mean, what should be the criteria for the sample size of people to be micro-targeted or not. I think the danger of let's start with the pluses. On one hand, political advertising can help mobilize different groups, make them receive information that seems to be more relevant to them, to their interests based on their profiles. At the same time, it's being criticized that there have been more of the psychological profiling as well, that the micro-targeting can also contribute to demobilization or to polarization of different views, as people are directly fed with information that only perpetuates certain views already that they may have, or even enhance them or change them if they're able to be persuaded, let's say, around the election period of the time. So we do have also issues that go along with the context. So for example, during the election period, we just saw a very interesting example in the Dutch elections that just had the parliamentary elections a few days ago, and the Dutch code of conduct that has been developed and adopted there. And we also have social media platforms that signed this code of conduct. So let's say it was, I think, Facebook and Snapchat and Google, if I am not mistaken. So there are a few who have actually kind of committed to have some key responsibilities to share information with public about the sponsors, about where the ads are coming from. There was also the whole aim to prevent the foreign interference. So there was kind of commitment not to take money for political advertisements from non-EU sponsors. And I think there are a lot of ways how we can either look at foreign interference influence or we can also look in overall the ecosystem of the amplification of different political ads. So I think there are quite a few issues. One aspect I'd like to highlight is for the users. As you mentioned in the beginning, I think we many times think of the responsibilities of the governments, of the platforms, but there need to be also tools that the users can use and platforms or the advertisers should provide, which is, for example, the opt-in or opt-out. But I would actually argue to have both. It should not be not only discussed to have one or the other. It kind of goes hand in hand. So if you opt in once, you should be able to opt out later as well and be able to adjust as things evolve. So having certain tools provided to users is important to allow for their agency of choice. At the same time, they need to be, I think, probably to a certain extent and in certain scenarios regulated, so they are there for the users to use in the first place. So maybe just last point, because there is a lot we can discuss further, but I think we need to also discuss the amount of money that is spent and who is behind those political ads. And I know that certain platforms online, digital platforms already provide that information, but I think for the transparency and for the understanding of the users to know where the political advertisements are coming from, it's necessary to know who is behind, who is paying, and also why are they being targeted. I think users need to know how it happened that actually they are receiving that, and so it should be this information as part of the transparency measures should be there as well.
Thank you very much, Nadia, for the input. I particularly value the focus on the user agency, because that often, yes, gets lost in these conversations. And another perhaps interesting just point for brainstorming is this, like you mentioned, opting in and opting out of being a target of political advertising or advertising in general. And also how do we design it? Because if you're automatically opted in, then perhaps you're not so much motivated to opt out. So it's also about how do we design these little points that can nudge you to a certain behavior. And also thanks for raising the points on the campaigning spending limits, because yes, I believe most of the European member states have these in place, but when we don't have, even though we do have some, information in the ad libraries, this information is very imprecise, it's unreliable, and then actually tracking and monitoring the exact spending limits becomes almost impossible. So with this, again, I'll turn to Marketa. We have just now highlighted several of these issues that we know present a problem from the perspective of transparent digital environment in terms of political campaigning. We mentioned the ad libraries, but what do you think that this EU legislation that will be published by the end of this year, what are some perhaps concrete areas or steps that the legislation needs to include in order for us to be able know that yes, some of these issues that you have also mentioned in your introductory remarks will be addressed on this regulatory level, while in the meantime, hopefully we'll continue educate consumers about the fact that they themselves are not entirely powerless in this process.
Thank you for the question, and also thank you for the remarks of previous speakers. I will start with a quick reaction to Ms. Kovalčíková, and then from that I will enroll into your question, because it's actually connected. I just wanted to also thank you for mentioning the user, because I think that's a key part of the triangle that's usually being forgotten, and emancipating them by giving them the information and the possibility for an informed decision is, I think, one of the main things that we should also strive for. With that being said, not only it's already in some Commission's proposals. The last one I think I've read from December, but we'll see. But also in my own personal opinion is, well, the idea of greater transparency obligations for platforms in the field of targeted advertising, amongst other requirements, of course. But I really want to emphasize the transparency. And before I talk more about transparency of advertising itself, I just want to mention, in relation with the mentioned user, the transparency in general of everything in their online space on the social media platforms is essential, because we also know that the social media platforms are, due to their algorithms, creating social bubbles and are closing in the users. And then it's even more difficult to really, as I mentioned, emancipate them and to so that they know what they are seeing, why they are seeing it, and what is happening. Because I think that organic reach or organic spread is something that we can't forget, is also very important. For example, Trump never really needed advertisement. Like, he used it, of course, but his reach, organic reach, was far beyond what an advertisement could do for him. So we should not forget about that. But quickly, for the transparency measure is in regulations, because I'm here as the person that talks about regulations. I think that, as I mentioned already, what should be a new thing are the penalties for violations, and so that they really mean something to the company with billions of revenues. I think that the Commission's current proposal includes fines up to 6% of the company's annual income. That is interesting approach. The problem is also that now tech companies can say they've been taking measures, but there is absolutely no independent third party who can verify their figures and what they have been doing. So another thing, apart from the transparency, like outside on their platforms, is also kind of transparency on the inside. I'm not talking about breach of business secrets, of course, but really to exercise kind of more democratic control over how our rights are being affected by the products of these companies. So they are now carrying out their own risk assessments, but there should be some kind of information obligation and accountability towards the general public. Of course, the EU's oversight is something that's like on hand, but I think it doesn't have to be just EU, of course, that there can be some kind of discussion over that. But well, yeah, transparency and this kind of information obligation are the most important points in the upcoming DSA and DMA legislations, in my opinion. And I will stop here, not to take time even the others.
Thanks, Marketa. Yes, absolutely. I was quite surprised to find that, yeah, the very large online platforms can be fined up to 6% of their annual income, and that the DSA is planning to put in place auditing responsibilities and requirements. So that will be interesting to see how these play out, and hopefully that these efforts should be efficient. We already have one remark from Jonáš Sirovatka from PSSC in Prague, and he very correctly pointed out that we haven't actually addressed the definition of political advertising yet. So very, very timely and true remark. So this is perhaps something I'm gonna turn to you, Nadia, with, even though I realize this is extremely tricky. As part of the code of practice on disinformation, there is this distinction between political advertising and issue-based advertising. And from our monitorings at GLOBSEC, I think Avaz has done something similar. This kind of distinction seems rather arbitrary, and it has led to a lot of sort of political content falling through the cracks of basically being categorized as political content. We had the false positives, we had the false negatives. So so this distinction is not exactly clear. Let's put it this way. So what do you think, Nadia? Is it even possible to come up with a reasonable definition of political advertising that will work across all digital platforms, that will work across whole single market? Or do we need to simply regulate all ads? This is something that European Partnership for Democracy has suggested, which I find quite intriguing. Actually, was the idea that let's keep the ad libraries, but let's not limit them to political advertising only, because actually, even as part of what we have discussed as user empowerment, having ad libraries with everything that's been targeted at users is perhaps the way to go. What do you think, Nadia?
I agree that this is an important question, at the same time very difficult one to answer, and even more difficult to legislate on. But I definitely agree that we should have clear definitions in the laws when legislating on political advertisements specifically. Perhaps the place to start is that we already have legislation in the offline, as I kind of suggested earlier, and has been also discussed at the Commission level, that needs to be also understood and translated in a way to the online space. So first, use what we already have and see how applicable that is, and not go perhaps further before we have that clarified, which hopefully should be the easier way, as there is already some legislation in place for political advertising. Second, if we could kind of maybe generalize what it is, well, it's the sponsored political content that is right there either to advocate for or against election of a candidate during the elections, either national or European elections, and promoting certain messages that are remunerated, that are sponsored to advocate for certain candidates or the parties to be elected. So I think this is kind of a more generic definition that is kind of a basic part, or a lot of that has been already mentioned also in the European Democracy Action Plan and defined in the code as well. So I think we can work with that. Also looking perhaps to the experience of some member states, as I mentioned, particularly the very recent Dutch Code of Conduct in the Netherlands, I think is also a place to see how that worked out, which platforms and why did they sign or they did not sign it, the political parties, actually the chairs of the political parties that signed it. I think there were 11 out of 13 chairs of the political parties currently at that time in the parliament that signed that pledge. So kind of discuss these practices, I think, is a place to start, to see how it worked or why there was some perhaps distance or refusal to go forward, and if there is a need to work on those aspects further and use what we already have in some way and just build on that. I think that is quite a reasonable place, and already some national practices that we can potentially apply, at least within the EU.
Thank you, Nadia. Marketa, you have your hand raised. Did you want to react to this question from Jonas as well?
If I may, I will be very, very quick, just a minute, because I think Nadia said it really well. I just wanted to mention that this is a so important question. As with everything, we need definitions. And well, actually here the problem is political, because it might seem obvious, like, okay, so political actors, but who is actually a political actor right now? Can it be an oil company that pays for advertisement against some kind of legislation? Well, probably it's about the legislation, but can it be an oil company that just pays for advertisement against environmental agenda and their arguments, which might influence legislation in the long run? So this is very gray zone and problematic. And to be honest, I really look forward to how the shadows and rapporteurs will deal with that in the GSA and in DMA, because I don't envy them that responsibility. But that is also why I think that the more broad approach, as I mentioned, the information obligation and transparency is even better now, because we are really maneuvering in a zone where we don't know what is the scope, what we are against. Yeah, so sorry, thank you. I really wanted to say.
No worries. No, I think absolutely this is important. As I said, I myself am intrigued by the idea of having like broader scope of the advertising libraries rather than just issue-based or political-based, so as to not miss these important clues. And now I turn to you, Owen, again, because I believe Mozilla has done quite a lot of monitoring, actually, political spending on the 2019 European parliamentary elections. So in your view, how much of political advertising is basically used to promote disinformation, if you have that data? Do you think it's a prevalent problem, or do you think that it's a topic that it's being kind of blown out of its proportion?
Thanks. That's a really interesting question. I think it kind of complements very well the earlier discussion on definitions of political advertising and what should be disclosed. So I think maybe a bit of context for the 2019 election and some of the work there was obviously after what had happened in a number of national elections in Europe, in the US and Asia between 2014 and 2016. By 2018, there was a lot of concern in political sectors and the general civil society movement that online platforms were being weaponized through their advertising functionalities to sow disinformation that had an effect on political discourse. And so for that reason, there was a real concern, like what is going to happen with the 2019 European elections? And do we need to have in place specific rigorous regimes to try and minimize some of that threat to democracy? And so for that reason, the European Commission convened the Code of Practice on Disinformation in 2018 on the basis of a high-level expert group on the future of media and the future of pluralism and disinformation online. And we were part of that expert group, and we were one of the first advocates, and then ultimately one of the first signatories of this Code of Practice. And I think the Code of Practice, where that came from, was this basic problem. And I think on the basis of the conversation we're having today, it is still a bit of an issue, just the complete lack of transparency into what is happening online. We don't know what advertisements are circulating, who they're being targeted at, and what kind of influence that they're having on people's online perspectives. And so a lot of the commitments that were made in the initial Code of Practice was about trying to kind of pull back the veil on that and to try and get better understanding. And so I wasn't involved in work around ad spend, but I was involved in some of the work around just seeing how the platforms were implementing some of the commitments they made with respect to working with researchers, working with fact checkers, having in place labeling policies and so forth. And I think we'd be happy to admit that some progress was made, that the code did deliver on some of its initial expectations. However, we'd be the first person or the first entity to argue that a lot more still needs to be done. And so for that reason, we've been quite supportive of the efforts of the European Commission to revitalize the Code of Practice, make it a lot more rigorous, underpin it with KPIs and so forth, and also to situate it within a much more comprehensive approach to content regulation in the EU. And so I think this also gets back a little bit to the discussion we were having about definitions. because like the European Partnership for Democracy, we have also been a strong advocate that obligations shouldn't be carved out on the basis of what counts as political, what counts as issue-based, and so forth. Because we saw in the 2019 elections that very often platforms were under-disclosing the type of advertising into their archives that we would consider political. And the reason being is because if you take a narrow definition of political advertising and situate it just in terms of something that's about a political party or a proxy for a political party, that is not going to capture all of the things that we're interested in. That is that you will see online that is quite a narrow scope. However, if you have a broader scope which deals with things like issue-based advertising, you're going to miss out a lot of stuff because the platform simply are unable to properly assess everything that is an issue-based advertisement, and very often we're going to have different kind of understandings of what that is being. For instance, the example Marketing made of oil companies, for instance, doing advocacy work. And so for that reason, we have long called for disclosure obligations to apply to all advertising, so all commercial advertising on a platform, and that it should include not just the actual advertising content, but also some of the key targeting parameters of that advertising. Because very often what's important is not just what's in the advertisement, but also who sees the advertisement, because then that can transform an innocuous mistruth into something which could actually count as voter suppression, depending on who that advertisement is actually targeted at. So those have been two of the big things that we have been calling for. And I think if we get to that situation where we have ad archives which cover all advertising, include targeting parameters, but also try to get at some of the novel forms of advertising we see online, then we'll be in a much better position. And by novel forms, I mean, for instance, many of you will have seen the example from the US presidential Democratic primaries when former mayor of New York, Bloomberg, was trying to enter the race. And so he was paying influencers on Instagram to promote his political messaging. And by most standards of ad archives, that would be outside the scope. And so that would not need to be disclosed. But obviously, like we're seeing the way online platforms are developing and emerging and innovating, there's a lot more forms of kind of what Nadia called paid online influence that is coming to the fore, which kind of falls outside the scope of traditional advertising. And so it's really important that the upcoming initiatives kind of take that into account and give us the kind of systemic transparency into how those kind of forms are working.
Thank you, Owen, for these very interesting points, especially on exactly considering like all commercial advertising is worth having this focus on transparency with the link to what user can essentially know that it's being targeted at him. If we look at it, I'll give you one more question just because of this private sector viewpoint that you represent. In your opinion, what should then be aside? I mean, we've already established that no self-regulation doesn't work and that digital platforms will actually not go as far if we are not gently or even not so gently pushing them. But in your opinion, what should be the golden industry standard for advertising transparency and reporting? Because given Mozilla's kind of unique position in the market, as you say, not for profit, it kind of gives you this freedom, I think, to think about the industry problems from a bit more, let's say, freer perspective, because you certainly have perhaps different objectives than the other digital platforms. So, because industry standards can be something that can also be helpful in these kind of issues. So, what do you think should be the golden standard for the industry?
That's a really interesting question, and it reminds me, going back again to some of this work around the 2019 European elections. Back then we had a lot of, because basically one of the commitments we had made in the code of practice on disinformation was that we were going to do research into how like online advertising was working and how various platforms were disclosing and the kind of transparency associated with that. And that was a really difficult task because each platform has a different ad library. Each platform populates that library with different things. And very often, back in 2019, we found that many of the ad archive libraries just didn't have great functionality. And so for that reason, we convened a coalition of, I think, about 27 to 30 independent researchers who are working on like advertising transparency to basically set out the criteria as to what a good ad archive should look like. What kind of functionality should be available, what kind of data should be included, and how all of these different things should be standardized. And I'll happily post that white paper into the Q&A chat afterwards, because I think it might be really helpful for people who are working on the specific topic of the mechanics of disclosure and standardization. As a general point, the thing which I think we're a little bit concerned about in this debate is we are starting to see in various legislative initiatives and at various member state level in the EU, initiatives that focus on ad transparency, be they the Digital Services Act, the EU Code of Practice 2.0, the political ads regulation, or the example that was given of the Dutch voluntary code of practice for the last set of elections. I think for us, what's really important is that all of these systems, even if they are distinct and focused on different things, that they are to some extent consistent and that they are to some extent interoperable. Because I mentioned earlier that we are generally supportive of a regime which is a kind of a ad archive disclosure obligation that covers all forms of advertising. And for us, that we think that is the important baseline and solves some of the under disclosure and kind of tricky boundary questions that you see with other definitions. However, at the same time, we're generally supportive also of the fact that for political advertising, however one chooses to define that, that probably should have some higher levels of transparency. I think that should include things like the spend, much more detail on who is actually placing the advertisement, their kind of political party affiliation, for instance, and also probably a little bit more specificity on what type of individual that political party is trying to target. I think for that type of advertising, given its nature, I think kind of a more sophisticated disclosure regime is important. However, what we don't want to see is, because of that like necessary distinction, that we end up having one platform having multiple different ad archives and the data being different in each one and not being possible for comparative reasons. So one thing that we're really happy about on this question of standardization is that the Digital Services Act, the draft law, I think it's Article 33 or 34, does focus on standardization and does kind of incentivize national regulators, the European Commission, and the affected companies and civil society organizations to come together and to work out kind of standardization for what more kind of broader disclosure would look like and how to make it interoperable or universal. So I think that's going to be a long-running task, but at least policymakers seem to be aware of the challenges there.
Thank you, Owen. So with this, I'll have one more question on transparency to Nadia, because I think that's quite a nice bridge from what you just described about perhaps the golden standards being that these ad libraries can be interoperable, so that we have systematic data. So it's not just more data and more chaotic data, but that we can actually see what's going on, that we can then track different, perhaps even disinformation campaigns or any kind of other harmful influence operations being carried out over a number of digital platforms. That would be actually quite helpful. But I wanted to ask you, Nadia, with this that has been said, because you've spent a lot of time at GMF researching foreign influence, foreign interference. So in your perspective, because obviously it's hard to sometimes quantify, and it's sometimes hard to also attribute these foreign influence operations, even because of issues surrounding transparency. How prevalent is foreign interference in Europe? And how do you think these kind of basic industry standards would help towards uncovering them and also then countering them, of course?
Good question. I think interference or manipulation of information, be it from the actors or others, works very well when there is either a certain vacuum of information, so people do not have enough information or regular or clear and accurate information in a way that they would be able to consume it easily and regularly, or in those kind of gray zone areas where there is not enough clarity about the rules or about that information that is provided publicly. So considering either the vacuum of information or the gray areas, I think addressing those two, at least those two, there are many more gaps that we can be addressing, but those two kind of areas that tend to be exploited and abused by also foreign actors that want to perhaps either undermine the democratic processes or confuse or create certain doubts, if they are addressed in a way that they are either smaller or try to be eliminated through these regulations or more common standards across allies or democratic countries in the EU, as we say, it could go much further, right? Internet is open. So I think we also have interest that there is a healthy information space more widely and have more standards that could be internationalized and applicable also by other countries beyond the EU. So I think having that in mind is important, that the responsibility, I think, of the EU and of the EU member states, I think should also be in a longer term and a bigger kind of sense for other countries and other users beyond. So having some criteria is the way to go. I think protection of personal data is also very important. Some malign actors also have interest to exploit that, to either be able to access it or exploit it for their purposes. And I think in the EU, we have already good efforts and tools in place to be sure that the personalized data is further protected, while at the same time transparency is ensured. So we also need to, I think, keep in mind the independent auditing. So while we have cooperation with the social media platforms and the governments, there also need to be independent oversight of that. And there need to be periods when we adopt a regulation until when do we expect to have the code of conduct developed by the countries, so let's say, or the platforms, and then implement it. And as it was mentioned earlier as well, there needs to be a cost for not complying with those as well. So if you raise the costs, it might also be some kind of a deterrent to either foreign interference or other actors to use this or abuse the existing loopholes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nadia. So one thing that we haven't addressed yet so much is fact-checking, essentially. It's one of the things that has been quite controversial in the past, because we know that certain digital platforms for a long time opposed the idea that political speech should be fact-checked, and then by extension also political advertising. So this is just your expert opinions on what do you think should this legislation do in terms of fact-checking, if it should do anything, whether political ads should be fact-checked, if so, by whom, under what circumstances, what should be the result for, let's say, discovering that certain political ads contain disinformation, because I mean, it seems so straightforward. We think, yes, of course, it should be fact-checked. Yes, of course, politicians shouldn't disseminate political messages with sponsored political messages with lies in them. But actually, once you start digging into how this whole process should be operationalized, it becomes quite tricky. It also touches on, obviously, issues of free speech. So I was just wondering, how would you personally approach this conundrum? Perhaps you, Marketa, what are your thoughts on fact-checking and political advertising?
Thank you. And as you kind of mentioned, do you have an easier one? No, it's very important, important question, and thank you for that. First, I need to address that I don't think it should stay as it is now, when pretty much the platforms choose their contractors and the companies that fact check for themselves. I'm not saying anything against the platforms. Here in the Czech Republic, actually, the AFP and Laďka Morkovic is doing a good job. However, this responsibility shouldn't stay just with the platforms. As we already kind of touched upon here today, the platforms don't really have a social responsibility, such as responsibility towards their stakeholders, not towards their users. Therefore, this should be something well, as transparent as possible, where governments or the EU, of course, and the platforms cooperate together in procuring or choosing fact-checking organizations that can do it for them. And of course, they will transparently submit any kinds of steps and findings and things they are doing to the governments or to the respective organ that would check it, not just to the platform, because that is not enough. So that's one important thing that I hope that even the DSA or maybe some future legislation will address, because we are discussing that in our committee actually quite often in INGED, against disinformation and foreign interference. And secondly, for the freedom of reach, as a lot of us call it itself, well, of course, it's not a human right to have a freedom of reach. So naturally, the answer that comes to mind is, of course, that the political ads should be fact-checked. The real challenge comes with how we don't kind of have it even defined as we realized yet, and therefore, what is the thing that should be fact-checked? What are the ads? And if all of them, like, is it even possible humanly? Probably not. And if not, then is the outcome to use the use of AI? And can we actually use AI on something like that? Honestly, I don't think so, because the machine learning is not so far as to actually be able to, for example, even recognize between subtle nuances of what is actual lie, what is just a satire, and well, the usual arguments with any kind of upload filters. So where do we go from this? I really want to mention that I don't think that politicians should be treated differently from other users. I know that the platforms are doing it just because they don't want to have problems with politicians. And I do realize it's also very sensitive, especially when, for example, elections are coming, that we might actually have a problem that the elections did something or blocked something 2 days before the elections and actually might have influenced the outcome, which is a problem. But if we actually set up what I already mentioned, some kind of cooperation between the countries or the EU and the platforms, where the responsibility doesn't lie solely on the platforms, then I think we can start to fact check even politicians. And by fact check, I of course don't mean a censorship. I mean the standard usual, what we already kind of got used to it, marking, okay, this is a problem. Here are sources to correct sort of information. And well, I know I kind of didn't answer the question of political advertisement per se, but I think that's a really difficult question, actually. And I don't think that the DSA will answer it in itself. I just think that we should start with fact checking the usual organic reach sort of information, as kind of Twitter already did with, for example, Trump, and the most visible ones. And then, well, still kind of rely on the users themselves and their interaction with the ads, because even now, Laďka Morkovic or anyone else doesn't fact check all the content on Facebook, just the content that is flagged as problematic by some percentage of users. If this is possible even with advertisement, like it is possible to flag the advertisement. But if it's possible to fact check the mostly flagged advertisement being from politician or an oil company, then I think that is a way we can go. But I'm not saying it's the only way and it's the correct one, because this is really broad topic.
Yeah, it's just for brainstorming purposes, but I do like the idea that, you know, why not to have a political ad fact-checked if it's being flagged, absolutely. But also thanks for raising the point on AI, because I believe especially in markets which are kind of marginal, which are not English-speaking markets, I think the situation there is even way worse. And we've seen this in Slovakia and in other countries in Central and Eastern Europe, where we have one fact checker as well, independent fact checker. He's doing a great job, but he's literally one person for a market with 3 million users, you know, so that's kind of not sufficient, I would say. But in terms of the AI and content moderation, now we see that even content that is literally in breach of the community standards on Facebook is actually remaining there, because we know that during pandemic, Facebook has resorted to much higher usage of AI for the purposes of content moderation. And so much hate speech actually stays on Slovak Facebook because the system isn't capable of actually evaluating it correctly. So we even had pages suspended that are dedicated to highlighting crimes of totalitarian regimes in 20th century, you know, wrongfully. And then we have neo-Nazi pages which simply spew out hate, and literally the content stays online. So that is definitely another massive issue and very good point to raise. But I see, Owen, that you would like to also comment on this issue, and then perhaps I can open up the floor to questions from our audience, because we do have a couple more.
Yeah, I think just to come back on the fact-checking question, because I think it cuts across so many of these issues with respect to online content and what to do about harmful and illegal content. And I think the first kind of principal consideration that we would make is that advertising content is not the same as organic user-generated content, in the sense that that content is submitted to a platform, it is placed by the platform, and the platform ultimately monetizes that content directly. It is advertising. And so for that reason, I think it is perfectly reasonable to say that unlike traditional like UGC, which is uploaded by a user without any prior review, I think it's fair to say that for advertising, particularly political advertising, there is a higher responsibility on the part of the platform to ensure that advertising is in conformity with its terms of service or with applicable law and so forth. I think it's also on the broader point. I think it's important for us to remember that fact checking, even like you mentioned that in quite correctly, that in non-English speaking markets the situation is even worse. But even in kind of core markets where the platforms face most pressure to kind of address this problem, I think we're never going to get to a stage where fact checking alone is sufficient to address the problem, simply because there is just so much online content out there. These platforms are so huge. But I think also that doesn't dishearten me so much, because I feel that it's not necessarily where the full solution is going to be found. And to give you an example, for instance, from the disinformation space, if I walk down the street and I meet somebody and I tell them that I think coronavirus is a hoax, that is unfortunate and it's bad, but it's not necessarily a policy problem or something that we as a society should care about, that specific incident. However, if I go onto a platform and I buy advertising which says coronavirus is a hoax, and then that advertising is amplified to thousands of users and then micro-targeted at those users for whom it's going to actually probably change their viewpoints or have an impact on them, then that becomes a policy problem. And so I think in that sense, rather than focusing solely on the fact-checking piece and saying we need to make sure that advertising is not misleading, looking more at the ways in which the ecosystem is working, the way in which it can be weaponized by bad actors to ultimately undermine democracy and change people's viewpoints in deceptive ways. So for that reason, I think that's why we're quite optimistic with the Digital Services Act, because it does start to look kind of under the hood and look at these systemic ways in which online experiences are being curated. And obviously there's a lot of work to be done there, and there's a lot of more elaboration required. But I think putting the focus there rather than just on the user or just on the content is an important step forward.
Thank you, Owen. I think these last points of yours actually tie nicely to the two questions that we have from the audience. So Ricardo Silvestre is asking that now that with the Digital Services Act coming up, we will have more information on and data on political advertising, whether our speakers see more moves to other levels of controls and checking veracity of advertising, which is what we have been just discussing. But Ricardo raised a really interesting point about medical questions with COVID, because that's really a massive issue. And yes, it's exactly that issue where we can say, well, is this a political thing or is it not? Because, you know, on a first look, it seems like, no, this is a health issue. But seeing how we know a lot of campaigns, also actors, I'm sure Nadia could comment on this, and on vaccine diplomacy, for example, from China and Russia. Actually, health hoaxes around COVID, I would say, are political. And, you know, if we want to talk about political advertising, this is certainly a closely related issue. And then another issue which pops into my mind in relation to what Ricardo is saying about political ads being used for lies and misinformation is also ads placed through ad companies on websites that peddle disinformation. This is another issue which, because often when we speak about political advertising or disinformation, our minds jump straight to social media and digital platforms, but actually a lot of money is being earned and disseminated through ads of legitimate companies which simply place them, you know, on websites of very nefarious content. This is $1 million business, as a Global Disinformation Index has estimated several times. So this is another issue that if we think that European legislation should also address these issues, related issues, which border on political content and which peddle disinformation, which can be deadly, how should European Union do that? Perhaps question on Nadia or Marketa as you see fit. Would you like to start?
I can take a first step, and I'm sure there is a lot to add from the legislator point of view. Definitely, I think during the crisis, we have seen certain new measures being adopted, either by the social media platforms or the governments. And some of them, I think, would be very useful to keep them sustainable beyond the crisis. So I think one of the things to consider is which of these measures, either redirecting the citizens to further authoritative sources and concrete questions of how to protect themselves during the COVID pandemic, how does it spread? So more detailed and accurate information from the sources of authoritative organizations or experts. And these concrete issues could be, I think, very welcome to continue using this kind of length of reference, and also providing context that there have been these other articles already written on it. So if the reader is interested to go deeper into the issue, learn more, there would be also reference provided. So the information would be more in the context, which many times is missing. And that's how it's easier then to manipulate that information if people do not have that contextual understanding. So I think this is something to definitely consider, how the kind of more emergency measures that have been adopted during the COVID-19 pandemic should be sustained, and which ones, and commit or compel the social media platforms to continue with these measures beyond a temporary periods. So I think this is one of the recommendations I'd like to throw out there, and looking forward to hearing more from also the legislative point of view.
Thanks, Nadia. Marketa, what is your viewpoint?
If Owen doesn't mind, because he had his hand raised first.
Okay, sorry.
All All right, thank you. I would, as I already mentioned a lot regarding the social media platform advertisement, and I don't want to talk about it for another 10 minutes or hour, it's possible. Let me touch upon something you mentioned, and it really caught my interest because yes, we kind of forgot about it, which is the advertisement on other news portals or portals or websites that are spreading disinformation too, and they actually have quite a huge business built on that, and also thanks to the advertisers. And I don't want to be like a broken record and still repeat the same word, transparency, but it is actually something that might help a lot even in this regard. If we actually know where are the finances coming from, what are the flows of the finances, who is sponsoring what, and where, that might help. Secondly, of course, if the company is just supporting the existence of the website by advertising there, that might be not something to sanction or to be problematic in terms of legality, but we might kind of agree that it's problem based on morality, and then I would kind of argue to name and shame, to actually make it transparent so that we can say, well, this company is supporting with its money clearly disinformation website or even disinformation foreign actors, and well, now it's public and you do what you do, market, and customers. And I think that would be very helpful in kind of societal pressure, not just legislative, towards these issues. Quickly, I want to also mention that what we have to kind of balance here, and why I'm talking about morality rather than legal actions, is that, but for example, Baltic way of doing things or dealing with these things is very, it's kind of nice. I would really love to do it their way. They just straightforwardly ban Sputnik, from their country, and they don't care. And it sounds really nice, but we kind of have to balance here between freedom of speech and censorship. And I understand that the Baltic countries might have different problems, being their proximity to some foreign actors and malicious actors. However, we still need to also account for our historic experience, and that we kind of want to go the least intrusive way possible. So that's why I'm talking about this, just so that it's clear where I'm standing here on the censorship topic. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. And I think this also works the other way around. There are these initiatives. I always advertise the Central European initiatives, Konspiratori.sk or Neles.cz, where they turn this issue around, and they try to motivate brands to educate them and tell them, look, your ad is being placed next to Sputnik and it's actually damaging your brand. Do you want to continue with this, or would you prefer us to give you a script which will allow you not to advertise on problematic web pages? So this is something that could be, I think, scaled up, because not too many people know that actually these kind of initiatives already exist, but they could be much more scaled up. And then, of course, the naming and shaming, absolutely. It's within also customers' rights to know whether they want to purchase products or services from companies that really have different ethical standards, let's say, than they do. But I see also that Owen, you wanted to chip in on this topic.
Yeah, sorry, actually, I meant to put my hand down because it was still up from the first time, but I'm happy to quickly say, I think actually the area of monetization of disinformation, that's one of the areas where I think we've actually seen some of the best progress in the last couple of years. And you can be optimistic about this, or one can be cynical about it, because I think that one of the main reasons why we have seen so much progress is because money ultimately talks. And in many respects, big global brands who have billion-dollar advertising budgets every year. They just simply do not like the fact that their advertising might be next to hate speech or political misinformation or others. And so for that reason, they have they've been putting the most pressure on the kind of the advertising ecosystem and the real-time bidding mechanism to try and ensure that their content doesn't get inadvertently placed beside or their advertising beside some bad content. Obviously, what's holding that back from being even more successful is, again, this lack of transparency, that many advertisers simply do not know where their advertisements are showing up. And I think that piece, the DSA is going to address that to some extent. It is going to foresee codes of conduct on online advertising, but I think that a general reform of the ad tech ecosystem, in particular, to bring more transparency both to users and also to the advertisers who depend on that system, I think is going to be a really big step forward. And then quickly to speak to the original question about like what happens next once we get transparency. I think if you look at the general direction of travel in Europe and elsewhere, we're moving away from these kind of what you might call like content-centric approaches, where we look at what's happening online and we say we need to filter more things and we need to take down more things in ever shorter periods of time. And that has been the general modus operandi of a lot of the ways in which the EU and its member states have dealt with the online ecosystem in the past. But I think now there's a growing recognition that kind of bad and objectionable content online is a feature rather than a bug in the system. And so it's more about management and governance rather than complete suppression. And so I think that in the advertising space, particularly with respect to political advertising and how it can be used for disinformation and so forth, I think transparency in this case is not an end in itself, and it's going to be a prerequisite for more specific and more targeted action. And we've seen just on this panel some of those ideas outlined. And I think hopefully with some of these upcoming initiatives, we will get the kind of transparency we need to think through smart policy approaches. Because to give you an example, on the question of, say, for instance, promotion of authoritative sources in recommender systems, I think that, like, as a matter of principle, there is some good, like, smart reason to that. However, getting into the details of what counts as an authoritative source and how you should do that practically is going to require a lot more thinking. And the same with micro-targeting. How should you limit micro-targeting? So I think hopefully, I don't think this is going to be the final word, but I think the transparency is going to be the prerequisite for a lot more kind of behavioral regulation going forward.
Thanks, Owen, for that, and also for pointing out the nitty-gritty difficulties once you start developing these ideas that, yes, on a first superficial look, they sound great. Let's promote authoritative sources, and I totally agree, but then you need a system and you need independent sort of categorizing system that will distinguish between authoritative sources and between what isn't authoritative source. It requires some sort of classification, which isn't, I don't think it's impossible to do. I just think it's really important to do it in a way that's truly independent and expert sort of based, because otherwise this could potentially be very unfair if it backfires. So exactly like working out those details of how this should be done is a tricky thing. But I still believe that actually this is doable. We've had another question from Rufin Zamfir, but I believe we have more or less touched upon the issue of political advertising and the way it's being used for dissemination of disinformation. So we have already touched upon that, but perhaps we haven't yet spoken so much about the issue of micro-targeting, as you just highlighted, Owen, and this is one of the big issues of this or big parts of this conversation. And I guess the question is whether to allow micro-targeting or not, and if so, to what extent, what is acceptable micro-targeting, what isn't, is socio-demographic characteristic acceptable, is using personal psychological profiles of social media users acceptable, is acceptable using some other private information that digital platforms hold about us, because often they know more about us than ourselves at this point if we are frequent users of social media. So the question is micro-targeting. How should the European Union or the legislation approach this issue? I'm not here looking for like perfect solutions, but anything that you think is relevant when considering this very important topic. Nadia, what is your take on micro-targeting in political ads?
A lot has been mentioned about the reach and the size and the responsibility of the companies based on their scale as well, and the impact that the information has when amplified across their platforms. I think this needs to be taken into consideration when we speak about micro-targeting. If we speak about smaller online media platforms or some very small actors, I think that the consequences are very different if we are talking about, broad, big campaign of micro-targeting prior to the elections to really influence the voters one way or the other. I think that needs to be taken into consideration if and when we regulate on micro-targeting. I know there have been also a lot of thoughts at the EU level to consider complete banning of micro-targeting in certain scenarios. I think that's it's something to definitely discuss. What are those scenarios that we consider a threat or too big of something at stake to totally ban micro-targeting? We have to definitely always think of the freedom of speech, as it was mentioned, but freedom of speech does not equal to freedom of reach. And I think that's where we also need to sometimes be more courageous to distinguish that and allow for perhaps more regulation on the micro-targeting and distinguishing it from the freedom of speech in that sense. I do think that it's important to discuss the restrictions, especially when the users or the citizens are not necessarily having a choice to choose if they want to be or not micro-targeted. Because I don't think we are discussing questions or do you want to be micro-targeted or not? We are discussing concrete websites and platforms all the time, and you have to click those opt-in and opt-outs all the time. And I think there could be a wide, bigger question, but I don't think no one really wants to ask it, especially from the social media or advertisers' point of view. Do you want to be micro-targeted at all or not? And I think we should also be discussing these kind of choices of do we really want to have that, and should it be decided at a bigger level, or should it be an individual decision?
Thanks for pointing that out. Again, coming back to the user emancipation and empowering the user as a potential solution to some of these issues. And I believe Marketa would also like to say a few points on this issue.
Thank you. Well, Nadia already described it really well. I have two additional thoughts that I was thinking about. One is, well, I'm not that old, and I still remember the times when micro-targeting wasn't a thing. And if I remember correctly, we still kind of survived, we still bought products, the economy was still running. Maybe now I will be kind of radical, but I don't really think we really need micro-targeting per se. And especially we don't need it if we know from not only, but Cambridge Analytica, how problematic it can get if you really can get deep down into one individual single person, their desires, what can influence them, etc. I actually discussed this with representatives of Google, and what I came to think after meeting them, apart from what I'm already saying now about, well, I don't mind not having micro-targeting at all, is that if we had really informed opt-in and opt-out, then it might not be such a huge problem. If you really want to have crafted advertisement just for you, or mostly for you, of course, because there are still some limitations and need to be some limitations, then all right, but we are not there yet, and there is still a long way to go for such an emancipation of users. And I will always be for emancipating the user or empowering, and letting them make informed decisions for themselves. But before this can happen, we still have kind of fire in the forest, and we have to put the fire down before we seed the new trees. I would say that the limitation of micro-targeting, and especially in terms of any kind of political decisions or before elections, is essential even for keeping our democracies, and after what we've seen with Cambridge Analytica. So yeah, I know that some revenues would fall down, and I know that companies would be very very unhappy about that, but we need to kind of balance what's at stake against what it actually brings. So yeah.
Thank you, Marketa. Yes, important questions. And also in terms of choice, like if you're signing terms and conditions where micro-targeting is basically a described condition of a platform that is used by a half of people in your country, where you have your relationships, where you have your work contacts there, it's also a question of, is it really a choice? That's another thing, whether the customer in a monopolized kind of economy is truly free to choose whether it's an option or not, if it is linked to the provision of a set service. But I see that Owen also would like to react, and perhaps we can just use this as closing remarks, because I'm conscious of the time, and I see that we could carry on with this conversation perhaps for another hour, but our time is limited. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this is just a quick reaction to the two previous comments on micro-targeting, but I think it can also serve as a general final remark from my side. And basically, I want to just reiterate what I heard somebody else say recently on a panel, which was that the GDPR is a great piece of law and somebody should try it sometime. And I think that has a lot of relevance for this discussion on micro-targeting, because micro-targeting is hard to solve for, it's hard to even define. But I think if we were to look at the GDPR, and the kind of, at least in principle, the restrictions on data collection, the restrictions on data processing, and the restrictions on profiling that are in place in that piece of legislation, then I would be hopeful that many of the things that we have concerned about in the political advertising micro-targeting space could actually be addressed. I think that is that's one thing which we can't lose sight of, that we already have some really good laws on the books, and if those laws were implemented and enforced in the way which I think that many of us think they could be, then it would address some of these big problems. But obviously that doesn't negate the fact that the political space is unique, and some of these things do require specific intervention. And so this legislation upcoming is going to necessary to deal with this question. Thank you.
Thanks, Owen. Yes. We have one last final question. So perhaps I'll use this as a chance for Marketa and Nadia to have their closing remarks. It's a question from Suse Mailian, and it's about the progress of voluntary measures and regulatory measures. Suse is asking whether basically the initial push shouldn't be voluntary, if you agree with the fact that first the codes of conduct and gradual steps towards creating healthier information space should essentially start with voluntary codes of conduct, and only then after some time perhaps to basically use regulation as a binding force sort of to truly implement these steps, whether you think this is the right way to go about it, or whether we should be more, hardcore and just regulate straight away. What is your opinion?
I might begin if Nadia doesn't mind. I quite agree with what the question suggests. Suggests hour and a half. The companies or the corporations, even the monopolies, they actually, from at least what I've gathered from them, hate the legislative vacuum that we currently have, and they want some kind of clear legislative environment in which they can actually operate, because they don't really like this all this responsibility to be kind of forced upon them, because that's actually a lot if you don't want to have the societal responsibility, if you want just to produce money. So of course they don't want bad regulation to happen towards their businesses, but also they don't like this vacuum. So I think actually that some voluntary codes of conduct are a great way to deal with this and go around it. Already now there is the code of practice on the EU level, and most or even all of the biggest companies voluntarily joined the code of practice and are fulfilling it. And the Commission is making it more and more strict, let's say, now that, for example, the companies should submit some monthly or yearly reports on how they are fulfilling the code of practice, which wasn't there before, and they are obliging happily. So I think this really shows us the way to, okay, they will join happily the voluntary code of conduct, and on that we can actually manufacture the best possible regulation or legislation for the future. I think that legislation needs to happen without a doubt, but if it goes like this, that we first see on the code of conduct what works, what doesn't work, where the companies have a problem and where we actually have a problem and we don't want the companies to do anything about we don't want to, then I think it's very nice soft way forward, and I think that the EU actually already does that. So we are on a good track. Thank you.
Yes, Marketa, thank you. Yes, it can seem like I know that from the outside perspective, it seems like a never-ending process. You know that for users, this seems like okay, but this means we'll have regulation in like 4 or 5 years. Perhaps yes, but on the other hand, somehow it's better than having a regulation that totally backfires and that perhaps also damages freedom of speech, or that is later on scraped by constitutional courts because it simply, is not in line with the member states' constitutions, so on and so forth. Nadia, what is your opinion?
I agree with the fact that it takes time to regulate, and I think it should. And there is a reason why regulation takes time, especially in the areas which are evolving, I would say, as we speak. But at the same time, I do think that sometimes, especially when it comes to big data and big consequences on people's lives and decisions, we also have to be courageous, and some areas we cannot take everything and let's say everything will be part of one legislation. There need to be, I would say, very clear, concrete ways to look at it. So like now the consultation on political advertising, I think it's important to separate certain areas that we discussed, from the micro-targeting to transparency, and have like very precise and well-defined, as I think we have agreed, categories of legislation. So I would say legislation is important. It does take time, and that's fine, but we also should not wait for the companies to tell us what they would like it to be, because we also have and are responsible for the citizens, for democracy, and for the stability and security of also the information space and others.
Brilliant, thanks a lot. So the main points I'm taking away from this discussion and to the consultation for the European Commission is, of course, transparency, this massive word that contains a lot of sub-segments that will gradually deal with financing, sponsoring, making the ad libraries much more comprehensible and perhaps compatible with each other, so that we really get more clarity, which is absolutely essential for user empowerment, which is the second point that I'm taking away from this discussion in all its forms. The questions around choice, having a choice to be subject of micro-targeting or not, and finally perhaps those management of content and information flows per se, which is a very technical aspect, but it's definitely very important, so as not to just create information chaos, but truly have clarity in how political advertising is serving us or not in some instances, and how it can be properly managed. So thank you very much to all three of you. This has been a great discussion, and I think we touched upon a lot of ideas in a very substantial way and a very useful way. So have a nice day, all of you in our audience too, and hopefully see you sometime soon in a similar situation, or perhaps even in person in the future. Fingers crossed. Thanks a lot.